Good day, listeners. Thank you for tuning in to the Water Talk podcast hosted by the Moving Water Alliance. I'm Parth Gupta. I'm an environmentalist with the Planet Cause. Our guest today is Benoit Le Roy. He's the CEO of the South African Water Chamber. Today, we'll be talking about water scarcity. How serious is it? Welcome to our show, Benoit. We're thrilled you could join us. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Thank you, Parth, and your listeners. I'm really honored to be part of your podcast. And yes, I've been in the water sector for 4 decades now. I'm one of the founding partners of the South African Water Chamber, which we'll talk maybe a little bit about later. And our aim is to overcome the water scarcity issues within South Africa specifically, and then into the subcontinent. And we're really an organization, an association that represents the interests of the private water infrastructure supply chain and collaborate heavily with government and have been quite key in part of the policy development and expediting various subsets thereof. So we're in exciting times at the moment.
It really is, yes. Thank you so much for your introduction, Benoit. So in 2018, it was estimated that more than 2.1 billion people do not have access to clean drinking water. That's 1 in every 4 people on the planet. And the truth is that water scarcity is not something really far off. It's something that we're living with on a day-to-day basis. The pressing concern is actually how serious is it? Is it something that people just talk about for the media hype or to scare people? Or is it a reality? Is this something that people don't appreciate or realize today?
I think it's not a binary answer. I think it's 2 parts. There is an element of water scarcity, but to me, that's the smaller element, because there's plenty of water in the world. 70% of our surface area is covered with water. Mm-hmm. And we need to shift our paradigms. So the water might not be in the right places, and it might not have the right amount of salt out of it, but to me, there's a lot of water, and living in the 4th industrial revolution, we have all the technology to overcome this. Mm-hmm. I think the second part of the issue we have is really that water is not a high enough priority within our governance systems. So, and what we're finding in South Africa, that it's in actual fact, out of the 10 most important things, 3 of them relate to water security in South Africa in upcoming local government elections. So I think society is starting to realize that it's not just energy and housing, it's water, because without water, there's no dignity, there's no life, there's no economy. So I think it's a combination of both. And I think that we need to really understand the water cycle a lot better. And I think that starts at an education level to a certain extent. And, areas that have very serious water scarcity, like in the Middle East, have in actual fact water security. So the technology is there. But I think it's a very deep discussion. It's philosophical, but I think us as society are the only ones who can help push to make it our top priority in the world, because it relates to not only economic activity, but it relates to food security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Talking about the society, right? When we hear about water shortage statistics and these stories, right, we often imagine these, poor communities just not having water. The thing is, people in urban centers often take water for granted. We always expect that, when we turn the tap on, there will always be water flowing out. But the truth is that just isn't the case. As per UNICEF, in fact, half of the world's population could be living in areas with water scarcity in just about 4 or 5 years from now. That's 2025. So could you share some stories here where you've seen such problems even in the developed world, right? Something that shows us sort of the scale at which this problem is affecting us today.
Yes, I think it's driven by not overpopulation, but by urbanization. So it's a concentration of population in areas. And, 1,000 years ago, that used to be driven by water and trade was driven by water, and cities and towns were all around water, either on the coast or on a river. Where I live in Gauteng, in the center of South Africa, is we have very little water. We import all of our water from different watersheds, and we've been doing this for over 100 years because of our gold mining. So we took water to us. And so if you look at the situation in Cape Town, which is a mixture of first and third world, is they nearly ran out of water, a couple of years ago with the so-called day zero, and we're going to be the first town of 4.1 or 2 million people that would run out of water. The reality is the population had grown, but water security was not viewed as a priority within, let's say, both governing parties. So supplying housing was the big drive, and roads and shopping centers. There's not very big industry. There's it's very tourism and food and beverage focused. But at the same time, Rome was also about to run out of water, and the Italian population is not growing. So the other population issue, to me, we mustn't overplay it too much. It's to do with urbanization to a great extent, but also it's to do with really tapping into, let's say, sustainable sources of water, as opposed to relying on finite sources like groundwater, which you also have in India, where if you over abstract and doesn't replenish, becomes a problem. But if you look at California, who's running out of water, it's, they have had a drought like Cape Town had. It was drought induced, but the reality was the fundamentals of the water supply is really based on surface water. And with climate change, our surface waters and our dams are far less efficient. They're evaporating much more. The rain is not necessarily in the same catchment areas. What we're also finding is that the duration of rain, especially in the southern hemisphere, it's very heavy rains and for very short periods of time. So the seasons have changed, intensities change. So we need to really look at how we harvest water. And to me, if you look at the greater water cycle, the sea is the source of most of our water, apart from the polar caps. And desalination takes place naturally. And to me, that is part of the solution, where your base load should be from the sea, and you top it up from your surface and groundwater resources, and reusing water. But we mustn't think that we can reuse water over and over and over. There are downstream users. In South Africa, we've been reusing water for over 100 years, and our agriculture depends on the downstream flows. But we can also reduce our water footprint to an extent. But we'll talk about that a bit later. We've got small water, and we're focusing on small water in the towns. The big water is, in actual fact, with 70% of our water is used, and that's in the food supply chain.
Yeah. Talking about California, I think you just mentioned, right? So while I feel like the media probably doesn't give enough coverage to these issues, right? I was honestly surprised when I heard about examples of this scarcity sort of manifesting itself. Just talking about the scenes such as the water rationing which happened in California. I mean, just to think, residents were ordered to cut their water use by 33%, and then they placed restrictions on stuff like gardening water. But the thing is that a lot of the developed world, when someone uses more water than their allocated limit, they're fined, right? However, what's your opinion, right? Is a system which is based on fines for, let's say, going over the water limit really a deterrent? I mean, people with money don't actually feel it. I mean, they have the money to bear the fines. And so at the end of the day, what we have is that the poor face the brunt of this water scarcity. I mean, I believe that if policing is being done for water use, right, it should be policing everybody equally. So how do you police people not to use too much water?
You see, if you look at what Rome did and what Cape Town did, is they imposed heavy fines, and that cut the up to two-thirds on average in Cape Town, 50% decline, but up to two-thirds reduction in the water demand. And there's very little industry in the Cape Town metro, so to speak. In the 4 million, there's 1 million people who are classified as indigent, who are unable to pay for water. They only use 4 to 5% of the water. What happened is it collapsed the entire system when you reduce the water demand, because now the upper middle class and the wealthy started reducing their water not to the required levels, reducing it, and the cross-subsidy couldn't be effective. The problem doesn't really lie in the cities. 70% of our water in the world is used in agriculture, which is food production. So the embedded water in people is between 4,000 to 6,000 liters a day in the food we eat. And that's what we need. For me, that's the bigger priority. So within the cities, we can control it to an extent, but the reality, the root cause is in actual fact in the food production. And I'm not saying we shouldn't eat certain foods and the likes. I'm a great believer in diversity, in diet and the likes. And it's part of our cultures to a great extent, but also there are ways of improving agriculture's water footprint. And that, just saving 10-20% on agriculture is going to have a much bigger impact on within the towns. Having said that, in the towns, the biggest wasters of water are not the people, it's the government's distribution systems. And in South Africa, our leaks are 36-37% on average. And our non-revenue water, which accounts for some theft and for some, let's say, billing issues, is 41%. So why put new water into a system where more than a third is actually leaking? And the global average is 25%. And in the developed world, it tends to be closer to 25. In the developing world, closer to 45. So, it's, to me, it's government prioritizing, it's government putting incentives into agriculture, because agricultural water is heavily subsidized in the first world. And that doesn't drive efficiency. So that's where I think part of the focus has to be, because the cities, yes, they can reduce their leaks and the likes, and they have to reduce it. In Cape Town, before the drought, was at 14.8% leaks, which is very, very low. So it can be done, and it wasn't done to the detriment of anybody within society. What Cape Town did do is shut off water. They put in, they call them weapons of massive destruction. They put in these water meters that only gave you, I think, 150 liters a day, and they cut off. And they did that with the wealthy and the likes. So that did work. So it didn't matter how much money you have. But also what they did in Cape Town, they've been doing this for nearly 20 years. That's why the water leaks are low. They do what we call pressure demand management. And what that does is reduces the pressure with low demand, so the system leaks less. Because replacing the system in Cape Town, for example, is about $5 billion to replace the network. There's just not that money to do it. But what we have to do is accelerate the efficiency of the infrastructure maintenance a lot quicker within the towns. But agriculture is where the biggest hit is. And if you have a look at our biggest issues in California, and if you look at the Indian subcontinent, and you look at the southern parts of Europe, is agriculture is sucking the groundwater dry. And that's really where a lot of the focus has to be. So to me, there's no reason why people who can't afford to pay for water should be affected at all. They don't use a lot of water, they don't waste water, they're unable to do that. So I think we can find a balance in the approach.
I see. Yeah, and I think you have a really good point there. In fact, we've sort of, and I'm quite impressed at some of the steps, which the government has been able to do. And the good part is that it's actually backed up with a noticeable decrease in, let's say, either the wasting percentage or the total water use. So I think that looks like hope is on the horizon there. But just talking about, we've seen these initiatives done by governments, right? But I also sort of want to focus on the private side of this thing, right? Things such as incentives on recycling water, effluent treatment plants. What we've seen is that in most cases, these solutions are a little too expensive for either individuals or corporations. So what are some of the steps which you feel that governments around the world, right? And we've spoken about a lot of the places where this problem is even more endemic. What are some of the incentives government should, for instance, take, incentivize the public, incentivize these corporations and individuals to actually take up such projects which could save water rather than waste it? Because right now it just seems like it's easy to waste water, and so they do.
So again, I'll go back to agriculture. That is where our biggest issue lies. And if you look at what they're doing in the Middle East, in the MENA region, for example, there's very little wastage of water in agriculture. So it can be done. The technology is there, and it's not at a premium. And what we found in Southern Africa is that the farming community are very early adopters of technology, because it gives them resilience. I think industry uses about 10% of the water in the world. So industry, and in the EU, your effluent discharges are normally around 10%, at 10 times the water purchase price. So most of the EU, especially the wealthier nations, are reusing their water, and they have sustainability reporting to the shareholders, where water footprint is as important as carbon footprint. So I think from an industry perspective, a lot is done that can be done. I think from a city perspective, what we can do is improve, and we see a big drive outside of the EU. We see a very big drive in direct reuse. In other words, not for potable, but for reusing. So at a utility scale, because our systems in our cities are designed to they have big centralized effluent treatment plants to treat the sewage and industrial waste, which is a small part of it. It's 10% of it on average. Okay, it does vary in places, but to reuse that water. But the big issue is when you're reusing the water, you can reuse water. You know, we use potable water for a lot of industrial and commercial processes where we don't need potable water, like for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, the HVACs. You can use treated sewage to do that. But now we need a twin reticulation system. And that's been tried in various parts of the world with limited success, because there's quite a cost in doubling up on your reticulation. Then we say, well, let's do it at a household level. The reality is the average household in the world can't afford to do it, and we've got to be very careful of health issues. Once you start, the reason why our towns are quite healthy and have grown since the Industrial Revolution is that we take all of the contaminants that are waterborne and we flush them out of the cities. So I'm a big proponent of utility scale reuse, because what that does is it really addresses the health issue. And then we have scale, and what happens is reuse that water, but sustainably, because the downstream users tend to be other cities and towns, and also tend to be agriculture. And definitely they are in South Africa. We have been reusing water potably from sewage in Southern Africa since 1966. And so we've overcome the yuck factor. You know, the old adage of toilet to tap, it's really ugly, but it's really powerful. But we've done that in South Africa because we've been, you know, let's say water wise for a very long time. And there's a whole stream of projects being developed as we speak now at utility scale to do that. But it will not only be for potable, commercial, agricultural, and industrial use. So for us, you know, the technology is there. It's not a matter of not having the technology. It's a matter of having a correct mass balance in each catchment area and in the country. And there's the EU's embracing this, but it's very behind, for example, what South Africa is doing and what, let's say, California is looking at doing, and what Singapore's been doing, mainly on the back of a lot of South African technology. So the technology is there. It's a matter of society being more comfortable with reusing water, and it's safe to do. And in actual fact, we can do it very economically.
I see. And, you know, personally, I feel like just given agriculture is such a sort of high water use sector of the society, right? Especially coming from the Indian subcontinent, I definitely feel that easier access to the technology, as you mentioned, right? It's definitely something which I've seen happening already here. So it, you know, again, one of those positives which seems to be coming out of the system. Yeah. But you know, just shifting gears a bit, and I was just curious. So you know, we've seen sort of the success of the carbon credit system, and you've also mentioned how effluents are generally 10 times the rate of, you know, water for input, right? Do you think we need to expand these ideas and to other parts across the world? They need to be, you know, sort of more well accepted into the society. And if yes, which ones do you think are running at the forefront right now?
I think it's worked. I think the intention is good. because we haven't addressed climate change. So, you know, carrying on with industry in, let's say, the industrial north and offsetting it by buying credits in the less industrialized southern hemisphere, to me hasn't worked. So, you know, I don't know if that would work in water. What I do know, there's a large part of society that believes water is a human right. Now, if you look at the small water, that might be a human right, but 70% of the water is not a human right. Food is not a human right. Dignity is, but food is not a human right. We don't give free food to people in towns. We do give free water up to a certain level. So, you know, in the trading of water, and so if, you know, credits is a trading platform, the trading of water insinuates a privatization of water, which is generally speaking, especially in the developing world, not on the table. And in South Africa, water was nationalized, and I do not see that changing very easily. Whereas if you look at Central Europe, water has never been nationalized and it's run at a decentralized local government level, but they've got plenty of water. So it's a lot easier to do. Northern Australia is trading in water. California started trading in water. I don't believe it necessarily has had the impact. It could have an impact in, let's say, the wealthier nations, but I'm not sure that a trading of water with a credit system to drive efficiencies is going to be that easy to implement. But it's definitely worth exploring to see the lessons learned with carbon credits. If you could maybe have a platform that would address our water scarcity.
I think from the above conversation, it's very safe to say that one thing we can take for granted is that we are running out of water, and you know it's only going to get worse, which means we need to seriously think about solutions to tackle the problem, and they need to be tangible steps, right? And I definitely believe, right, as I think you do too, that there's much we can do without affecting our daily life significantly, right? Ultimately, the poor segment is just not the largest consumer. They don't end up wasting water. We're not the largest consumer. So, but in your professional view, right, just for our listeners, what is the biggest urban lifestyle activity, right, which you think wastes the most amount of water, and how do we curb it?
So I think that depends very much on the region. So in South Africa, we're accused of the middle class wasting a lot of water in our pools and in our gardens. I think there's an element of truth in that, where one can go to, let's say, more indigenous gardens and cover the pools and the like. So I think, you know, but you know, the term wastage is, we're accused in South Africa of wasting. We're using double the water the rest of the world. I think that's nonsense, because it's the cities in the distribution systems that are leaking. You know, I think water is underpriced in general in cities, so it gives less elasticity into, let's say, doing appropriate asset management. But, you know, coastal cities that have decoupled themselves from rainfall, and so in other words, surface and groundwater, and are desalinating, are now desalinating in the MENA region cheaper than what surface water and groundwater costs. And these are the latest numbers. So we're talking, so it's cheaper than South Africa. So what we need to do is look at the supply side more than the demand side in the cities. You know, and decouple ourselves from, let's say, the finite groundwater and surface water, because seawater is infinitely renewable and it's part of the water cycle, but the engineering has to be done correctly, and where it's done correctly, we see there's no environmental impacts, there's only enhancements. And what we've seen in Australia, for example, is that with the coastal cities who are using more baseload desalinated water, is that their inland water catchment areas have re-established themselves, and that's attracting more tourism, more wildlife and tourism and the likes, but making more water available for, let's say, their wine production, so their agriculture. So, you know, I think the biggest waste of water, well, the fact is it's government, it's the water distribution system, so that must be sorted out. And really, you know, we need to stop bashing the middle class who sustains everybody else. So if you want to have a pool, cover it, so be it. You have a garden and the likes, and charge appropriately, so that water can be paid for, and the provisions can be made for asset management in the long term, and that the indigents can also be cross-subsidized. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but in a healthy economy, everybody can pay for water. And yeah, let's just make sure that, in our society, people, to be quite blunt, are not, the middle class are not worried about their water footprint. And that to me is an education thing. So it's going to take a generation, maybe more. And I think we can do a lot through podcasts like these and through the media, but also through the education system. And I'm talking primary level, that we need to be aware of our water footprints because it is an issue. We're all aware of energy because that gives us bandwidth to be on the internet,
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. In fact, I think ultimately, I think it all comes down to, as you said, right, public awareness, right? If people are more aware, we'll be more conscious of our water use, and also we'll be able to, make our governments accountable, right, to stop being the biggest wasters of water. And I definitely sort of echo your sentiments there. One of the other sort of big things is, and we've talked about it a lot here at the Planet Calls, is about fast fashion, right? Which is definitely one of the up and coming culprits. In fact, it's very hard to believe that one cotton t-shirt utilizes 650 gallons of water to make. But as you said, right, it's not even about how much water is utilized, but over and above that enormous water use, there's also rampant illegal dumping, and all of these dyes, right, they ultimately find their way without being treated into the rivers and oceans. This is classic case of not just using a lot of water, but ending up polluting it with the effluents even more. Have you seen these problems come up, and how do we combat such industrial pollution?
So fast food and fast fashion, I agree with you, are definitely some of our not aspiring habits, but it's really driven by a very extractive, let's say, instant gratification society. And the more evolved the society becomes, the more it relies on fast food and fast fashion. So yeah, look, luckily, I think when it comes to food production, there's a lot of developments taking place that will address a lot of that. The story of cotton for me is quite interesting because hemp uses a fraction of what cotton does. And hemp got really sidelined by the big chemical industry in the Northern Hemisphere, starting in North America, because, and they use the marijuana, but hemp, generally speaking, doesn't have marijuana. It's one particular strain that does. And it was for the rayon production and the viscose. So for the, let's say, the synthetic production, hemp was really sidelined. But hemp, until the Industrial Revolution, was the fabric of choice, not just for clothing, but also for tenting, for sails on ships, for trade and the likes. So we need to look at alternatives there to an extent. But if you look at textile, and in India, you're using a more and more CO2 dyeing, which is a dry dyeing process. So you capture CO2 from heavy industry, and what you do is you use that in dyeing, so there is no effluent. The Central Europe developed this technology just about a decade ago, and the biggest early adopter was India. And they're saying the overall cost is in actual fact cheaper. So if we start using more hemp instead of cotton, and then if we start using, if you can't get out of fast fashion, we start using non-wetting dyeing processes like CO2, there's a switching cost, obviously. What happens is we're able to actually counter these things, so we can carry on having our instant gratification lifestyle, if you want. So I think there are solutions, there are root causes and solutions. And I think government's role here is in actual fact to tax. The problem is when government taxes, does that money does it get ring fenced? So in other words, you should tax where there's a wet dyeing process so that money can go into environmental rehabilitation. So the problem is actually tracking the money. Whereas I think, you should phase out. And maybe this is where the carbon credit trading comes in. In other words, it's an incentive to use waterless dyeing. And the biggest culprits of effluents are in actual fact on the Asian continent. So from India right through to the Pacific Rim to China, where we have a lot of textile manufacturing. And, you know, the world is really guilty of sending it there because there was water and it's cheap labor. And I think it's starting to bite us now, and we need to re-look at that. And I think COVID is helping us to re-pivot or onboard local manufacture. So we're seeing in the Western world a lot more clothing manufacture being and dye stuff, so textiles, restarting, and also mining, for example, so that to reduce the reliance on international supply chains. How that's going to affect the developing world is we have to see, but I think in Africa it's quite disastrous. It's affecting the sub-Saharan African continent quite badly, but it's also a wake-up call for us in that we need to start, you know, industrializing ourselves on a decentralized basis, as opposed to putting all of the industrial activity into one region in the world. So I think COVID, one of the unintended consequences is that it's going to, I believe, improve our environmental issues quite markedly.
Wow, that's definitely perspective which I didn't think of earlier. Yeah, because I feel like that's a lot of what the world today has done is shipped their problems off to offshore countries, right? And definitely we need to sort of remember that ultimately it's the same planet, right? And you cause pollution somewhere else, it's gonna come back to bite you. So I mean that's really good insight there, Benoit. It's actually unbelievable how serious the water scarcity problem has gotten today. And small steps like just changing, let's say, the textile dyeing process, or even just awareness initiatives taken, right, by people like you or by me, right, they can really help us in tackling this crisis. And while I'd love to discuss this further, I see we've almost run out of time. And we're really glad you could join us today, Benoit. And we look forward to having you back on the show sometime in the future. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being able to support our water security mission that we have. Nice speaking to you and to your listeners. Thank you, Parth.
Thank you so much. Thank you, listeners. We'll be back with you very soon.